She got the island by mistake. She thought she would just sell the house and start her life over. But in one of the rooms of the mansion, she found documents that turned the history of an entire family upside down and led her to dangerous people who were willing to do anything to hide the truth. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Mara Jensen had never imagined that rock bottom could feel so quiet. It didn't crash in with noise or spectacle or the kind of dramatic final blow she once feared in her darker moments. Instead, it arrived on a gray Wednesday morning when she stood on the curb beside a stack of boxes that held the last fragments of her old life. Her son, 11-year-old Luke, hovered beside her, hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, pretending he wasn't worried, even though the tremble in his shoulders gave him away. Behind them, the house she had lived in for 14 years. Her house, the one she had painted, repaired, lived and fought in, stood with its windows blank and unbothered, as if it had already forgotten her. Her ex-husband, Brent, didn't even come outside when she left. The man she had once trusted more than anyone had stood in a courtroom weeks earlier with a lawyer she never could have afforded, waving papers that claimed she had agreed to let the house remain in his name during the refinancing. She remembered signing something years ago in the rush of work and raising a child, but she never imagined he would twist it into a weapon. He got the house. She got nothing. And 2 months after the divorce decree, he introduced Luke to the woman he'd been seeing long before the marriage ended. Mara didn't hate him for falling in love again. She hated him for how easy he made her disappearance from his life, as if she had been a placeholder, a background shape, a convenience. She didn't say any of this aloud to Luke. She placed her hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, and told him everything would be fine, even though she didn't know a single person on the planet who believed that. She had a temporary motel room for the week and a part-time cleaning job that barely paid enough for food. She had no property, no savings, and no family to fall back on. Nothing except the filing cabinet of debts that her ex had left behind under her name, and her own stubborn refusal to fall apart where her son could see. She tried to hide the panic as she called for the rideshare that would take them to the motel. She tried to swallow the shame that rose in her throat like bile, and she tried to ignore the whisper in the back of her mind that told her she had failed. Failed as a wife, failed as a provider, failed as the one person her son needed to count on. She pushed the thought away so hard it left her dizzy. There wasn't time to collapse. There was surviving to do. The motel was the kind of place you stayed when you ran out of choices. The hallway carpet smelled like stale cigarettes and bleach. The walls were thin enough for her to hear a couple arguing 2 doors down. But Luke tried to make the best of it, as he always did. He lined his comic books along the nightstand, arranged his pencils on the desk, and told her that at least the place had Wi-Fi. Mara forced a smile and told him that it was only temporary, even though she had no idea how temporary really was. The first ray of luck, if luck was even the right word, arrived 3 days later when she received an email from a company she had nearly forgotten existed. Meridian Recovery Group. The subject line read, "Re-outstanding compensation settlement." She frowned at the screen, clicking it open, her breath catching as her eyes skimmed the long paragraph. Years ago, she'd worked for a small logistics company that had been quietly bought and absorbed into a larger corporation. There had been a dispute involving overtime hours and withheld benefits. At the time, she had been too exhausted and stretched thin to join the lawsuit, but apparently her name had still been attached to the payroll records. The settlement money had been distributed months ago, but there was a snag. Meridian didn't have enough liquid funds left at the close of the fiscal year to pay out her remaining portion. And so, they wrote, the company was offering her an alternative asset of compensatory value. Mara blinked at the screen. Compensatory asset? It sounded like someone was trying to dress up a mistake in corporate language. The email continued in cold, detached legal phrasing. The company had acquired various properties over the years through debt settlement and forfeiture agreements. Most had been auctioned off. One remained unsold, a private island previously owned by a government official involved in federal-level misconduct. The asset had been deemed non-liquid, but transferable. She reread the line twice before it sank in. They were giving her an island, not money. Not a check she desperately needed. Not funds to put a roof over her son's head. An island. She almost laughed, except the sound lodged in her throat instead, stuck between disbelief and despair. It sounded like a joke, some surreal twist that the universe had decided to throw at her. She imagined walking into the county office saying she was homeless because her only possession was a private island. It was absurd. But the property came with documentation, a deed number, an address, and a full transfer certification. She clicked through the attached files, each one more bewildering than the last. Photos taken from a surveyor's drone showed a sprawling estate sitting on the island's highest hill, overlooking dark water and dense forest. A mansion, practically untouched, though weathered by isolation. The island itself was several acres wide, located just off the Pacific Northwest coast, reachable by a short ferry ride run by the county. Her heart thudded unevenly as she scrolled. She had no use for a mansion. She had no desire to live on an island. But the real estate estimates listed were staggering far beyond anything she had ever imagined owning. Selling it could give her a fresh start. A real start. Enough money to rent a home, pay off debts, maybe even build a future for Luke, if she could sell it. That was the catch. According to the email's small print footnotes, the property had been seized from a high-ranking government official, Lionel Duval. The name rang faintly familiar. When she searched it, articles filled her screen. Corruption investigations, bribery, missing funds, possible links to organized crime, and then a sudden death that ended the case prematurely. After his death, rumors spread that the property was cursed, tainted, dangerous. Potential buyers backed out. Investors chose safer ventures. Journalists hounded the estate for months, claiming there were still secrets buried inside its walls. Mara leaned back in the motel chair, stunned. They didn't give her a miracle. They gave her a problem no one else wanted. Still, a problem worth millions. She printed every document she could, stuffed them into a binder, and spent the night making a plan. She would go to the island, assess the property, clean up what she could, create listing photos, and contact an agent willing to handle a high-risk sale. The island might be a burden, but it could also be an opportunity, the only one she had left. 2 mornings later, after returning Luke to his temporary tutor and packing what little they owned, she rented the cheapest car she could find. The vehicle wheezed on acceleration and smelled faintly of mildew, but it drove. That was enough. They headed north, miles of gray coastline passing by the windows. Luke watched the scenery quietly, occasionally asking questions about the island, about the house, about whether there would be animals or a place to explore. Kids had a strange gift for finding excitement, even in fear. Mara told him the truth. She didn't know what awaited them, but she promised him they would face it together. And that was more than she had ever said about the divorce or the months that followed. Her voice felt steady for the first time in weeks. The ferry station was small, manned by an older ranger who glanced at the deed papers without comment. He only raised an eyebrow slightly when she mentioned the estate's name, but he said nothing about it. He told her the last resident had vacated years ago and wished her good luck in a tone that didn't sound encouraging. The ferry ride lasted 15 minutes, long enough for the mainland to grow distant and the island to take shape. Dark forest rising from rocky cliffs, fog curling through the treetops, and at the center, perched like a watchtower, the silhouette of a mansion that looked far larger than any of the photos had suggested. Luke stood at the railing, hair blowing wildly in the wind, eyes wide. It looks like something from a movie. It did. But not the kind of movie that ended comfortably. When the ferry docked, they loaded their bags into the car and followed the single gravel road that cut through the island's forest. The deeper they drove, the heavier the atmosphere felt. Not frightening, but weighted like a place holding its breath. The mansion appeared gradually, rising from behind a curve in the trees. It was enormous. 3 stories of weathered stone, tall windows, dark behind thick curtains. Ivy crawled along the walls, twisting up toward balconies with rusted railings. The front door was carved oak, framed by pillars that once must have been beautiful. Now they were chipped and cracked, as if time had gnawed at them. Mara stopped the car and stared. It didn't look abandoned. It looked suspended. Paused. Waiting. Luke whispered, "Do people live here?" "Not anymore," she answered softly. The wind rustled through the branches. Something creaked, a shutter, loose on its hinge. Mara's skin prickled, but she pushed the feeling aside. They were here. This was her island now, her burden, her path forward. She unlocked the front door with the ornate brass key Meridian had mailed to her. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, exhaling a gust of stale, cold air. Dust motes floated in the slanted light. The interior was vast marble floors, chandeliers dulled by years of neglect, grand staircases curved like the ribs of a forgotten beast. The mansion smelled faintly of salt, wood, and something older beneath it, something like old paper sealed too long in a drawer. They explored slowly, room by room. The house was not ruined. It was preserved. Rooms filled with heavy furniture, covered with sheets. Hallways lined with portraits, whose eyes followed them with disapproving solemnity. Offices with locked drawers. Bedrooms that looked prepared for guests who never arrived. And then, on the second floor, in a corner room facing the water, Mara found something she hadn't expected. A study. Its door was slightly ajar, as if someone had entered last and never bothered to close it. Inside, dust coated everything except one desk drawer that sat crooked, not fully closed. She approached cautiously, pulling it open. Files, letters, folders with seals broken long ago, government stamps, court documents, handwritten notes, and near the bottom, something wrapped in cloth. She lifted it gently. Inside was a thick envelope filled with pages, stained by water, but still legible. And on the first page, written in crisp, furious ink, the property was stolen. From its rightful owner. From a man whose children lost everything. Mara's breath caught. This wasn't just scandal. This was evidence proof that the powerful official who once owned this island had taken it through fraud from a local businessman. A father. A man whose children were now suffering the consequences of that theft. Her hands trembled as she continued reading. More documents followed. Deeds, forged signatures, letters of coercion, false reports filed to the county. The puzzle snapped into place with horrifying clarity. The scandal had never stopped with Duval's death. His family, his children, were preparing to leverage his legacy for their own ambitions. One article she remembered mentioned plans for a large industrial plant, opposed by environmental groups, but pushed aggressively by Duval's heirs. These papers, these could halt everything. These could expose the truth. And if she didn't reveal them, the land stolen from that ruined family would remain stolen, and the island she wanted to sell would become the cornerstone of a corrupt empire. She closed the envelope and held it against her chest. She had come here desperate, homeless, hurt, and now this place demanded something else from her, Something heavy. Something righteous. Luke peeked through the doorway. "Mom, are you okay?" She looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of what she now carried. "Yes," she whispered. I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Outside, the wind swept across the island, rattling branches, carrying the faint echo of something long buried, rising toward the light. And for the first time in months, Mara felt something stir within her. Not fear. Not panic. Purpose. The next morning arrived shrouded in fog that wrapped itself around the island like a white, breathing veil. Mara woke before Luke, her mind already racing, the envelope of documents lying on the nightstand beside her, like a weight she could feel even with her eyes closed. She hadn't slept well. Every time she drifted toward sleep, the memories of what she'd read pulled her awake again. The forged signatures, the coerced statements, the confirmation that Lionel Duval had stolen the island from a local businessman named Samuel Kincaid, whose death years later left behind 2 sons who inherited nothing except debt and the rumors of their father's downfall. And now those same sons, the children of a ruined man, were scraping by in a small coastal town, while Duval's heirs were preparing to build an industrial facility on land that was never theirs to begin with. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Luke, and went to the window. The fog rolled in thick waves over the water, swallowing the horizon until the world looked like it ended a few feet beyond the trees. The mansion seemed even more isolated than the night before, its stone walls sinking into the mist as if dissolving into memory. She pressed her palm against the cold pane of glass and exhaled slowly. She had told her son they were where they needed to be, but she hadn't told him what that meant. Downstairs, the house was still and heavy. Dust stirred faintly in the air as she walked through the hall, each footstep echoing far too loudly. The mansion had a way of amplifying even the smallest sound, as if loneliness itself lived in the walls. She entered the study again, switched on the lamp she'd found in the corner, and sat at the desk with the envelope. Her fingers hesitated at the flap, but she forced herself to open it again. She needed to be sure she had understood everything correctly. She laid the documents out in a neat line, smoothing each one with her hand. There was a deed transfer form with a signature that didn't match the verified sample she found online last night. A letter from an attorney who no longer existed. His law office had closed before the date on the letterhead. A confidential memo stamped with a state seal that appeared authentic at first glance, but used a crest that had been discontinued years before. Every piece of paper pointed to the same truth. Duval had taken the island illegally, using forged documents and threats against a man without the resources to defend himself. Mara paused, reading one paragraph twice. Samuel Kincaid had tried to fight. He had written letters to the county court, to state officials, to investigative reporters. But each letter had been intercepted in some way, misplaced, dismissed, or answered with vague platitudes. The man's final correspondence, written only months before he died, mentioned that he felt pressured, watched, and silenced. Mara's chest tightened as she read those words. It sounded too familiar. The sensation of being erased, of having no ground to stand on, of watching everything you owned slip away into someone else's hands. She knew that feeling intimately. She heard footsteps in the hall and looked up as Luke appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep. "Mom, are you reading those papers again? You didn't sleep." "I'm fine," she said, closing the folder but keeping her hand on it, as if it might run away. "Go wash up. I'll make breakfast." Breakfast consisted of instant oatmeal and fruit bars they'd brought with them. The mansion's kitchen had every luxury, imaginable industrial stove, marble counters, copper pots hanging in neat rows, but no food, except expired cans locked in a pantry behind a rusted latch. While Luke ate, He asked her about the island, about what they would do next, whether they would stay long, whether she thought the house was too big or too strange or too old. She answered gently, vaguely, trying not to let her worry seep into her tone. After breakfast, they explored more of the mansion. Mara thought it might calm her nerves to understand the place fully, to know what shadows she shared her life with now. The hallways were wide and dimly lit, windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked the morning light. Dust coated the floors, their once glossy surfaces dulled by neglect. They found bedrooms with four-poster beds, guest suites with private balconies, an indoor sunroom filled with dead plants, and even a billiard room whose green felt had faded to a sickly gray. In every space, the same eerie feeling lingered, not of ghosts or anything supernatural, but of interrupted life. A house prepared for grandeur that instead became a vault of silence. When they returned to the main hall, the fog outside had lifted just enough to reveal the distant curve of the shoreline. Mara decided they needed fresh air. She told Luke to put on his boots, and together they walked down the sloping path toward the beach. The scent of salt and pine mixed in the crisp air, and though the island was small, it felt wild and untouched. Only a few birds broke the silence, their calls echoing across the rocks. Standing by the water, Mara felt her thoughts drifting back to the documents. The more she considered them, the clearer the picture became. The island was more than a burden. It was evidence that had remained hidden for years, buried in a room no one had entered since Duval's mysterious death. If she stayed silent, the Kincaid sons would never reclaim what was theirs. And worse, Duval's children people, just as ruthless as he had been, would lay the foundations for a massive industrial plant that could damage the coastline, destroy wildlife, and poison the economic heart of the coastal towns nearby. The moral path was obvious, but the logistical one was tangled. She had no idea whom to trust. Local authorities? They had failed the Kincaid family before. Reporters? They might twist the story or expose her identity before she had a chance to understand the danger. Lawyers? She had no money to hire one. She felt trapped between the weight of the truth and the fear of what revealing it might cost her and her son. Luke skipped stones on the water, oblivious to her torment. His laughter broke the quiet like a small miracle, reminding her momentarily that he deserved better. Better than fear. Better than instability. Better than a mother who was always 2 steps from collapse. When the cold wind grew too biting, they returned to the mansion. Mara let Luke explore the rooms he'd claimed as his own while she returned to the study, closing the door behind her. She needed to think without the distraction of footsteps or questions. She spread the documents out again, this time organizing them chronologically. The timeline of the theft, the attempts at justice, the cover-up. She traced each step with her eyes, seeing the pattern emerge. Duval had been careful, calculated, but not perfect. His arrogance had left cracks in the story. Cracks she could widen. The sound of the front door slamming startled her so violently her breath caught in her throat. She stood quickly, clutching the papers, her ears strained for any sound. A moment later, Luke called. "Mom, the wind blew it shut." She exhaled in relief and sank back onto the chair. The mansion amplified every noise, making her jump at shadows. As evening approached, the sky outside turned pale gold before dissolving into blue. The house darkened quickly, shadows climbing the walls like ink. Mara searched for lamps, flashlights, anything to push back the darkness. Many bulbs had burned out long ago, and the wiring in the mansion crackled when she flipped certain switches. But by lighting a few lanterns she found in a cabinet, she managed to make the main rooms bearable. She heated canned soup on the gas range, listening to the faint whistle of the flame. Luke drew pictures at the kitchen table, sketching the island, the waves, the silhouette of the mansion. He seemed content in a way she hadn't seen since before the divorce, and the realization made her throat tighten with unexpected tenderness. After dinner, she tucked him into the giant bed he had chosen, the one with carved posts and a window overlooking the ocean. She kissed his forehead, told him she loved him, and stayed there a moment longer, watching him drift to sleep. The mansion felt less intimidating with him in it, as if his presence softened the corners of the walls. Once he slept, she returned downstairs, unable to shake the urgency coursing through her. The documents needed action, but she couldn't be reckless. She sat in the study for hours, rereading every page, researching legal terms on her phone when the weak Wi-Fi allowed it. Each new detail pulled her deeper into the labyrinth Duval had built. She discovered that the Kincaid sons hadn't vanished into obscurity. One worked odd jobs along the coast, the other was listed as living in subsidized housing. Their father's name had been dragged through so much mud that no one had bothered to clear it. They were living proof of the damage Duval had done. Mara imagined them finding out the truth, that the island stolen from their father still existed, untouched, its secrets waiting to be revealed. The house creaked as she read, the sound stretching through the hallways like breath. She shut the folder and rubbed her forehead. A part of her wanted to take the documents straight to the Kincaids, tell them everything, hand the island to them and walk away. But she couldn't. The deed was legally hers. The responsibility was legally hers. And if she gave it up without strategic action, Duval's heirs would retaliate. They had power, influence, and an agenda she had only begun to understand. When she finally left the study, the house was still and cold, the air buzzing faintly with the energy of her restless thoughts. She climbed the stairs slowly, lantern in hand, the light casting long shadows along the walls. Halfway up, she paused, sensing something she couldn't define. An unease, a heaviness, as if the house itself was waiting for her next step. She shook the feeling off and entered her bedroom. As she set the lantern down, its light flickered, casting a brief glow on the documents she had placed carefully on the dresser. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at them until her vision blurred from exhaustion. She lay down, pulling the blanket over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. Her thoughts circled endlessly about the island, the Kincaids, the danger she'd stumbled into, the responsibility she had never asked for, but could not ignore. And somewhere between the beats of her growing determination and the tremor of her fear, she understood the truth. She wasn't here only to sell a house. The island had brought her here for a reason, the same reason the documents had survived in that room, untouched for years. She was the one who found them, the one who lost everything, the one who had nothing left to risk, except her life, her future, and the fragile hope she was trying to build for her son. She opened her eyes in the darkness, listening to the wind batter against the windows, and whispered to the empty room, "I'll see this through, no matter what it costs." Outside, the fog rolled in again, swallowing the island whole. And deep within the mansion's walls, the secrets she had uncovered seemed to hum with quiet recognition, as if the house itself acknowledged her promise. Morning would bring decisions, danger, and the beginning of a journey she never expected to take. But for now, the house listened, and Mara prepared herself for the storm she felt gathering just beyond the shore. The morning broke with a fragile stillness that felt almost deceptive. Mara woke before dawn, her mind already heavy with the weight of the choices she knew she could no longer postpone. The documents she'd gathered from the study lay on the dresser, tied neatly with twine she'd found in a drawer, as if binding them would make their contents easier to control. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Luke, and dressed in the uncertain glow of early light slipping through the curtains. The fog outside had thinned, revealing the silver-blue shimmer of the water stretching toward the distant coastline. For the first time since they arrived, Mara could see the mainland clearly. It looked close enough to touch, yet impossibly far symbolic of the life she'd once had and could never return to. She stood at the window for a moment, textbook stillness in her posture, then turned away. She had to leave the island today. There was no more room for hesitation. She made breakfast mechanically, more for Luke's sake than her own. The oatmeal thickened slowly in the pot, steam curling lazily upward. Luke padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His hair stuck up in soft, unruly spikes, and his voice carried the drowsy warmth of childhood as he asked what they would do today. Mara smiled faintly, but the heaviness in her chest dulled the expression. "We're taking a trip to the mainland," she told him, setting a bowl in front of him. "I need to talk to some people about the situation." He didn't ask which situation. He knew better than most children his age that adults carried more secrets than they spoke aloud. He stirred his oatmeal quietly, nodding with a seriousness that always both broke her heart and made her proud. When they finished breakfast, she packed a small bag, tucked the twined bundle of documents inside, and locked the mansion with the large brass key. The sound of the lock clicking echoed louder than she expected, as though the house was watching her leave. The drive down the gravel path felt slower this time. The trees leaned inward as if studying her, their branches whispering in the wind. Luke hummed softly in the back seat, watching the fog drift around them. The ferry station was empty except for the same older ranger who had checked their paperwork the first day. He nodded at Mara, but didn't comment. She wondered if he knew anything about the Duval family or the Kincaid scandal, and whether people in small towns really forgot the sins of their old rulers, or merely pretended to. On the ferry ride, she kept a tight grip on her bag. The wind whipped across the deck, tugging at her hair and jacket. Luke leaned against the railing beside her, fascinated by the way the waves folded and broke against the metal hull. She envied him his simplicity, the way he managed to find beauty in places she only saw risk. When the ferry docked, Mara felt her pulse quicken. The mainland felt unnervingly foreign after days on the isolated island. The town was small, but active fishermen unloading crates, small shops opening their doors, cars passing slowly along the coastal road. Everything felt sharper, noisier, faster. She parked outside the modest two-story building she had found online the night before. The sign read, Paulson and Reed Legal Associates. It wasn't a high-powered firm, but it was one of the few that had a public track record for taking cases against government entities and powerful families. She took a deep breath, squeezed Luke's hand, and walked inside. The reception area was simple, the furniture worn but clean. A woman at the desk looked up, offering a polite if tired smile. "Good morning. How can we help you?" "I need to speak with someone about a property matter," Mara said. The words sounded brittle, leaving her mouth. The receptionist asked a few preliminary questions, and then directed her to a small office, where a man in his 50s introduced himself as Patrick Reed. He looked tired in the way people look when they have spent too many years seeing injustice they couldn't always fix. But he also had an alertness in his eyes that made Mara feel slightly less like an intruder. She sat across from him, Luke beside her, and removed the bundle of documents from her bag. She didn't hand them over immediately. Instead, she started with the truth of her situation, simplified as much as possible. She told him about the settlement, the island, the mansion, and the paperwork she had found. He listened without interruption, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled as though he was holding all thoughts at bay until she finished. When she finally slid the envelope across the desk, he opened it carefully. He read the documents one by one, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concentration, then to something heavier, disbelief tinged with anger. He flipped through the papers slowly, meticulously, and when he reached the last page, he let out a low, incredulous whistle. "Where exactly did you find these?" he asked. "In a study on the second floor," she answered, "hidden in the back of a drawer. They were left there, intentionally, I think." "Intentionally," he repeated quietly, studying the papers again. "Ms. Jensen, these are not just incriminating. They're explosive. This is the kind of evidence investigators were rumored to be hunting for before Duval died." "So they're real," she whispered. "They're real," he said firmly. "And they're dangerous." The word dangerous pressed against her chest like a cold stone. She had known deep down, but hearing it aloud solidified the truth. She glanced at Luke, who stared at the documents, without fully understanding their weight. "What happens if I bring this forward?" she asked. Patrick leaned back, sighing. "You need to be careful. Duval's children have power, wealth, influence. They've been planning this industrial development project for years, and they're already negotiating with state representatives. If these papers surface, the project collapses. Their inheritance cracks open. Everything they've been preparing for goes up in flames. People don't respond kindly when that kind of future gets threatened." Mara felt her throat tighten. "I don't want anything from them. I just want the truth to be known. And I want Samuel Kincaid's sons to get back what belongs to them." "That's noble," Patrick said softly. "But truth is rarely simple. And justice can be costly." Her gaze dropped to her hands, folded tightly in her lap. She thought about the nights she'd cried silently in the motel room, about the years she'd spent shrinking herself to keep the peace in a marriage that eroded her. She thought about Luke's future, how she refused to let it be shaped by cowardice or silence. "I can't walk away from this," she murmured. "I won't." There was a long pause before Patrick nodded. "Then we'll do this right. Step by step. Quietly, for now. I'll need time to verify everything cross-reference signatures, confirm the authenticity of the seals, build a case that can withstand whatever pushback comes. You must be patient, and you must be cautious." She agreed. He made copies of the documents, logging them carefully. Then he returned the originals to her, insisting she keep them in a safe place. The tension in her shoulders loosened slightly. For the first time since discovering the papers, she didn't feel alone. When they left the office, the sunlight had strengthened, bringing warmth to the cold air. Luke asked if they could walk along the pier before returning to the ferry. Mara agreed. They stood at the edge of the water, watching boats bob gently in their moorings. "Mom," Luke said quietly, "are we going to be okay?" She hesitated only a second. "Yes," she said. "We are." He nodded, trusting her absolutely, and that trust anchored her more firmly than anything else that day. They returned to the island as the sun dipped behind the hills. The mansion loomed against the orange glow, its stone walls reflecting the fading light. Mara parked the car and stood for a moment, feeling the vastness of the island settle around her again. But this time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a pause, like the island was waiting for her next move. Inside, she placed the documents in a locked cabinet she had discovered in the study, hidden behind a false panel. The key fit perfectly, as though it had been intended for her hands. She secured the cabinet, tested the lock twice, then placed a chair beneath the handle out of instinct. The house creaked again in the shifting night air, but the sound didn't unsettle her the way it had before. She felt a strange connection to the mansion now, as though it had chosen her as its witness, as its catalyst. The idea was irrational, but the feeling was persistent. She cooked a simple dinner and sat with Luke in the dining room, the candlelight flickering across his face. After he went to bed, she lingered downstairs, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the ocean through the open windows. Her thoughts circled the day's events, the fragments of advice the lawyer had given her, the weight of the decision she had made. She was now part of a story that had been buried for years. She was responsible, not by choice, but by fate, for bringing that story back into the light. And with that responsibility came danger she could no longer ignore. As she prepared to go upstairs, she paused at the base of the grand staircase. A strange sensation filled her chest, an odd mixture of resolve and fear. She placed her hand on the banister, feeling the smoothness of the worn wood beneath her fingers. She whispered to the empty hall, "We're going to finish this." The house gave no answer, but the shadows seemed to shift slightly, like breath pulling inward. Mara turned and climbed the stairs, her footsteps steady. Whatever storm was coming, she no longer intended to run from it. The days that followed unfolded with a deceptive slowness, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Mara sensed the pressure building beneath the quiet surface of her routine. The same walks down the gravel path, the same cautious exploration of the mansion's forgotten corners, the same late nights spent at the study desk, with the lamp burning low and the documents spread before her like a map of someone else's crimes. But beneath that stillness was motion, gathering strength, the way a distant storm gathers at the horizon before anyone sees the first bolt of lightning. Patrick Reed called her the next afternoon. His voice, though measured, carried an energy she had not heard before. "I've confirmed everything," he said without preamble. "The documents are genuine. Every signature, every seal. Duval orchestrated the entire theft from forged county approvals to falsified environmental assessments. He used his office to strip Samuel Kincaid of his land, and the man died without ever being heard." Mara sat on the edge of the living room sofa, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. The mansion loomed around her in its heavy silence, as if listening. "Then we can move forward," she said softly. "Yes," Patrick answered, "but it won't be simple. I've reached out to the Kincaid brothers, Evan and Mark. They're hesitant. They've been burned by hope before, and they don't know who to trust. But they agreed to meet, and they want to meet you." Mara's breath caught. She had imagined this moment in countless ways, some hopeful, others fraught with fear. But reality brought a trembling uncertainty she hadn't anticipated. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said, "in my office. And Mara, be careful when you leave the island. Don't travel alone after dark. Duval's heirs won't be blind to what's happening for long." She thanked him and ended the call, her pulse hammering. She stared at the phone for several long seconds before looking toward the staircase where Luke was sketching upstairs. His pencil scratched faintly on paper, the soft sound drifting down like a fragile reminder of innocence. The next morning, she prepared for the trip with deliberate care. She packed the original documents in a folder she wrapped in plastic and secured inside her bag, double-checking the zipper. She made sure Luke had his notebook, his jacket, and the snacks she'd packed. She told him they were meeting people who needed their help, though she didn't elaborate. He accepted her explanation with quiet trust. The ferry ride felt different this time, tense, watchful. Mara scanned the dock as they approached the mainland, half expecting to see unfamiliar faces waiting in cars, watching her movements. But the pier remained quiet. The same fishermen going about their routines, the same seagulls circling overhead. She had not yet attracted attention, but the threat lingered in her mind, like a shadow trailing her steps. Evan and Mark Kincaid were already at Patrick's office when Mara arrived. They stood near the window, hands in their pockets, shoulders stiff. Evan, the older brother, had lines etched deeply into his face lines that spoke of long years spent battling forces stronger than himself. Mark looked younger, but his eyes held the same weariness. Patrick made introductions, then stepped back, giving Mara space. She met their gaze, feeling the weight of the documents in her bag pressing against her side. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the folder and laid the documents on the table between them. Both brothers leaned in. As they read, their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to something darker, a mix of grief and vindication. "This," Evan whispered, voice catching. "My father wasn't lying." "He wasn't crazy," Mark said hoarsely. "He told us over and over that he'd been forced, that they took everything. We thought he was paranoid. The officials said he made things up. They called him unstable." The brothers exchanged a look heavy with years of buried guilt and pain. Mara spoke softly. "He wasn't unstable. He was threatened, silenced, and the island was stolen from him." The room filled with the sound of breath being held, released, and held again. Patrick explained the legal implications, outlining what would happen next. A petition would be filed, a motion to reopen the case on the grounds of discovered evidence. The state would have to respond. An injunction could be placed on the Duval Children's Industrial Project. And most importantly, Evan and Mark could reclaim the land their father lost, land that now belonged to Mara through an illegitimate transfer. Evan turned to her, his voice thick. "Why are you doing this? You could have stayed quiet, sold the place, taken the money and walked away." Mara hesitated only a second before answering. "Because I know what it feels like to have something stolen from you by someone with more power. Because your father was wronged, and you deserve to know the truth. And because if I walked away, I'd be no better than the people who hurt him." The brothers nodded slowly. Gratitude flickered in their eyes, gratitude that looked like something they had not felt in years. It softened the room in a way nothing else could. When the meeting ended, Mara felt a strange clarity settle over her. She had stepped into her role fully now, not just as a witness or a discoverer, but as someone who had chosen to act. But as she and Luke walked back toward the car, she noticed something that made her stop cold. A black SUV idled across the street. Its windows were tinted. The engine hummed softly. And though the driver's face remained hidden, Mara felt an unmistakable prickle along her spine. Someone was watching. She forced herself to remain calm. She opened the car door for Luke, helped him climb inside, and kept her movement steady. As she drove away, her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The SUV waited, watched, then slowly began to follow. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Luke sat quietly beside her, unaware. The drive through town felt endless. Every turn she took, the SUV matched. Only when she approached the ferry dock did the vehicle slow and eventually turn off down a side road. She didn't breathe until she parked near the pier. Her legs trembled as she stepped out of the car. Someone knew. Someone had heard. Or someone had guessed. The ride back to the island was silent. Luke watched the waves. Mara watched the coastline disappear behind them. The wind felt sharper, colder, biting through her jacket. When the island came into view, the mansion rising like a sentinel against the twilight, Mara felt a mixture of dread and determination. Inside the house, she locked the door carefully, checked the windows, and guided Luke upstairs. He didn't question why she wanted him close. He simply followed. When he was asleep, she returned to the study, her lantern casting warm light over the walls. The documents were secure, the cabinet still locked. But something felt wrong, like the air had shifted, as if the mansion sensed the danger pressing in. She sat at the desk, burying her face in her hands. Exhaustion washed over her in waves, but beneath it burned something stronger, resolve, sharp as flint. She had begun something that could not be undone, and now forces far larger than her life were stirring awake in response. The next day confirmed her fears. Patrick called again, urgency crackling through the line. "Mara, the Duval heirs know. They're pushing back hard. Their attorneys contacted the district office, claiming you stole confidential materials from the property. They're preparing injunctions. And Mara, there was an attempt to access county archives this morning. Someone is trying to erase the original land records." The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Mara gripped the phone tightly. "What do we do?" she asked. "We keep moving forward," Patrick said. "I've already filed the petition. Public interest groups are taking notice, and the Kincaid brothers are prepared to testify. But you must stay on the island, for now. It's safer. You're there legally. They can't touch you without cause." The irony wasn't lost on her. The place that had once felt like a prison now felt like a fortress. After the call, Mara walked the halls of the mansion slowly. The air felt charged, as if the island itself were reacting to the tension. The chandeliers trembled faintly in the draft. The curtains rustled, though the windows were closed. She paused at the top of the grand staircase, fingers trailing along the railing. She felt small, but not powerless. Afraid, but not defeated. She whispered to the silent house, "You've held these secrets for years. Now let them come to the surface." As if in response, a faint groan echoed through the walls, just the old wood settling, perhaps. But it sounded like acknowledgement. Days passed. News spread. Articles appeared. Attorneys argued. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the Duval scandal. Environmental groups protested the proposed industrial project. And through it all, Mara remained on the island, waiting for the storm to fully break. One evening, as the sun sank low over the water, casting gold across the trees, she stepped outside with Luke. They walked to the edge of the cliff, the waves crashing below them. Luke slipped his hand into hers. "Mom," he said softly, "are you scared?" She thought of the SUV, the documents, the threats unspoken but clearly felt. She thought of the Kincaid brothers, standing with trembling hands as they read proof of their father's stolen life. She thought of the mansion, its shadows, its silence, its legacy. "Yes," she said finally. "But being scared doesn't mean we're wrong." He nodded, leaning against her side. "Will it be okay?" he asked. Mara looked out across the sea, the island behind her breathing in the wind. "It will be," she said, "because we're doing the right thing, and because we're not alone anymore." Luke squeezed her hand. "I think the house likes us," he said with a shy smile. Mara smiled too, the first real smile she had felt in days. Maybe it does. Above them, the mansion windows reflected the dying sun, glowing like watchful eyes. The storm had gathered. The truth was rising. And Mara Jensen, once homeless, once powerless, now stood at the center of a reckoning she had never asked for, but was no longer afraid to face. The island had given her a burden, and it had given her a purpose. And now, with the world watching, she intended to carry that purpose to its end. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. If you haven't seen the next videos, go watch them now. If this video helped you, share it with others.